Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. So today we're going to talk about Rhipsalis puniceodiscus. I would say that Rhipsalis puniceodiscus is one of the most sought after Rhipsalis because it is quite beautiful. And in the United States, it's not that easy to get though. In Europe, there seems to be sources for rather large, full, beautiful plants of it, albeit a lot of times they seem mislabeled as something that is a supposed hybrid under the name Rhipsalis Heidelberg. But if your plant has orange berries, long indeterminate growth, it's Rhipsalis puniceodiscus. The plants that are like these supposed hybrids or intermediates between Rhipsalis nivis normandii and Rhipsalis puniceodiscus, they should and do, from everything that I've read, exhibit characteristics of both plants. And most of the pictures that I've seen of the supposed Rhipsalis Heidelberg look exactly like Rhipsalis puniceodiscus. They have long, beautiful, indeterminate growth. So in the United States, there's only one resource that I know of where this is like publicly available, where you could just go online, and that would be through Horticalled LLC. But you're lucky if you actually find it in stock. So if we go to their website and we go to the Rhipsalis and we look here, we can open up Rhipsalis puniceodiscus and you will see that a 6-inch pot is $65, and the 6-inch pot legitimately kind of looks like this. It's a small plant that's inside of there. It's not like a great big full lush plant or anything. And then they have a 3.5-inch sort of starter plant for $20. I would recommend the 3.5-inch starter plant just because it's not totally that much smaller than the 6-inch plant, to be honest. They also sell on Etsy. And so in their Etsy storefront, it's the same name, Horticalled LLC. And every once in a while, you might actually find that they are in stock on Etsy when they aren't in stock on their actual website, which is the case here. They are selling a Rhipsalis puniceodiscus, but they're selling it for $185. And you can see the plant here. They say that it's an 8-inch hanging basket, and that appears to be the plant that you would get. So I'm going to repeat, you Europeans, you're lucky, because I'm willing to bet that if you went to Europe and you would get a great big, huge, beautiful, full, lush pot of this for a very small fraction of that price. In the United States, we're just really good at charging a lot for plants. And to be fair, that it really is a highly sought after, rather uncommon Rhipsalis. I would say that it is probably rare. And truthfully, if people are willing to pay that price for it, which you saw it was in 13 people's carts, so people were obviously considering paying that price for it. In terms of care, this is actually one of the Rhipsalis that is a little bit harder to care for. So mostly the issue with it is that under certain conditions, it seems to develop these kind of necrotic sections in its branches. So there will just be sections that will turn black. Mine definitely does it. It does it way more when it's growing indoors through the winter than when it's growing outside. That leads me to believe that it is probably an issue with getting the appropriate amount of airflow to the roots. I think that could probably be mitigated by your substrate, by adding more chunky materials into your substrate or watering less. So I have a very heavy hand when it comes to watering. I have been a chronic overwaterer my entire life, which is why I grow epiphytic plants. So not only does it grow with this very beautiful, like long, indeterminate branch segments that actually just looks like a long, lush green mane of hair, it also has beautiful flowers. So the flowers, they are erumpent, which is one thing to keep in mind about this, because the flowers actually form underneath the surface of the branches. When it flowers, after it dies, whether it forms fruit or whether it doesn't form fruit, it doesn't really make a difference. It will have a crater that is left in the branches. So it is a plant that you may want to restart frequently, because as it sort of ages, it will be left with a lot of scarring and it will just be less attractive. The flowers are quite large, somewhere between 2 and 2.5 centimeters usually. Flowers are white, and sometimes they have a little bit of a cast, like a little bit of an overlay kind of color on them, a little bit green, a little bit yellow, a little bit pink, that kind of thing. But predominantly the flowers are white. The ovary on the flowers, I've seen them be green, and I've actually seen them be kind of a maroon color as well. Now, the real sort of cool part about the flowers is the colored stamen. So typically, more often you see clones that have red stamen. The base of the stamen will be red, and the tips of the stamen might be kind of a pink, a little purple, magenta, subjective as to what most people would call those colors. One thing that was really surprising that I found out more recently was that it could also have yellow stamen. Now, a very close relative of it, Rhipsalis neves does the exact same thing. You can have clones that have yellow stamen and clones that have kind of a dark orange stamen. What's really interesting about that, though, is that this would happen because of betalains, and so different. It would be like a genetic thing where like this particular clone of this plant is producing more betalains and this one is producing less betalains, or a different kind of betalain. And the betalains are responsible for coloring parts of the plant a yellow or reddish, orangish colors. And so it depends on how that particular plant processes betalains. So sometimes a plant may exhibit having reddish roots, and sometimes reddish stamen, sometimes a yellowish flower, sometimes the branches will turn reddish. So it's not that it colors the whole plant, it just depends on how that particular plant is sort of moving those betalains around. And so that is the explanation for why you would have some plants that might have yellow stamen and some plants that might have these reddish stamen. The same thing is interesting and true about the berries. There are only 2 Rhipsalis that are known that produce orangish berries, one of them being Rhipsalis campos-portoana and the other one being Rhipsalis Puniceo-discus. And so the berries, they're pumpkin orange, but sometimes pumpkin orange is a little bit more of like a yellowy kind of orange, and sometimes the fruit does look a little more of a yellowy kind of orange. Sometimes it's a much darker, truer kind of orange. And I have read botanical descriptions that did describe the fruit as being a reddish color. So I would imagine that it can go into probably like a very deep kind of orangey red color that looks reddish. I do think that I have read somewhere that they could also be kind of a darker maroony color. So the species also does tend to have a subacrotonic branching pattern, and that means that the new branches tend to form sort of towards the end of the old branches, but not directly from the tips of the old branches. That is a way that there's only a handful of Rhipsalis that really do that, but it is a way that to be able to kind of tell them apart a little bit. I have read descriptions that say that it can also branch acrotonically, which means directly from the ends of the old branches, but I have yet to really see that in any of my Rhipsalis Puniceo-discus. And it also has kind of darkening around the areoles, which, if it's not grown in higher light, it just looks kind of like a darker green coloration around the areoles. Now, if it's grown in very high light and it is capable of producing betalain, sometimes around the areoles can become extremely dark, kind of a purplish color actually. But I want to say that that's not really a defining characteristic for that species, because a lot of Rhipsalis species have that characteristic. It's not something that should be used for identification for Rhipsalis at all. Another thing about the branches is that they tend to be very flexible. So some other Rhipsalis that have a very similar growth pattern to Rhipsalis Puniceo-discus would be Rhipsalis holleri and Rhipsalis lindberghiana. Rhipsalis Puniceo-discus in particular tends to have very flexible branches in comparison. And the growing tips of the branches tend to be a little bit pointed, which is just kind of an interesting thing that like sometimes you can sort of tell or see when you're looking at them. And they do tend to form, like when the new growth comes out, it does tend to form little loops. And the reason for that is because the growing tip gets stuck in the immersed aerial, and so it takes a little while for it to push the tip of the branch out. It is not the only Rhipsalis that does this. Actually, Rhipsalis holleri can do it too, but it is the Rhipsalis that does it the most. So that is one thing that, you know, if you're looking at pictures, if someone is like selling something or whatever, and like they don't know the identification of it, it is one way to be able to determine that. I do want to add that another way to be able to get this particular Rhipsalis species is to look for it on eBay, look for it on Etsy. You can join the Facebook groups and do an in search of post, because there are a lot of private sellers out there, or just a lot of group members that are willing to trade. I hope that you've enjoyed this video on Rhipsalis puniceodiscus. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy cacti growing.